Pleased to call this hearing to order. As you know, we've gathered today to examine several of the bipartisan infrastructure law's investments in habitat and ecosystem restoration. As we do so, we're privileged to have leaders from two key agencies join us to discuss our shared goals of supporting infrastructure development while also protecting important wildlife habitat. With that, I want to begin by welcoming Martha Williams. Usually we don't ask witnesses to testify under oath, but since it's your birthday today and we're interested in finding how old you are, we might, no, seriously, happy birthday. And thank you for spending your birthday with all of us. I understand your parents are still alive. Tell your mom and dad we said thanks for bringing you into the world and raising you and sharing you with all of our nation. But with that, I want to welcome Martha, Director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Brian Fouch. It's Fouch, right? Rhymes with couch? There, hi, Brian. Have people ever mispronounced your name, Brian? No? Okay, good. You're the Associate Administrator for Federal Lands at the Federal Highway Administration, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? For how long have you held that post? You start right out of high school? Okay. Well, we thank you both for taking time to join us today. Since helping to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, a large portion of which was written literally in this room by Senator Capito and other colleagues in our staffs. But since helping to pass that law over 2 years ago, our committee has spent a fair amount of time analyzing its implementation. I say it's one thing to have hearings on legislation. It's another thing to vote in committees, subcommittees. It's another thing to pass it in the House, the Senate, reconcile the differences, get the president to sign it. But the hard part sometimes is implementation, and we've continued to focus a whole lot on implementation of those pieces of legislation. As we implement the transformational investments in our nation's roads and our highways and our bridges, as well as our drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. Today we will build on that earlier work by discussing some of our law's lesser known but meaningful investments in ecosystem restoration, wildlife crossings, and pollinator habitat. I've long believed that we can grow our economy and support jobs while protecting our environment. That's a theme that you'll hear voiced almost every time we meet in this committee. Programs that we're examining today and the fact that Congress is investing in them through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I might add with the encouragement of the current administration, are proof that I'm not alone in that belief, or that we're not alone in that belief. Specifically in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we provided the Fish and Wildlife Service with $455 million to facilitate fish passage across our nation to support 4 regional restoration initiatives, including the Delaware River Basin program. Today, we look forward to hearing from Director Williams about how the service is putting these dollars to work quickly and how these investments improve resiliency and leverage private investments. In the Delaware River Basin, we have seen firsthand how restoration activities oftentimes make our communities stronger while benefiting our economy. And for example, we know that when we make our ecosystem more resilient, clean up our drinking water, and conserve wildlife habitat, it makes Delaware a more attractive place to work, to play, and to live. And I think that's true not just for the first state, it's true for all states. And as part of our bipartisan infrastructure law, we also provided the Federal Highway Administration with $350 million to stand up a pilot program for wildlife crossings across the country. In addition, we authorized $10 million over 5 years for the agency to support pollinator-friendly roadsides and highway rights-of-way. And why did we do that? Well, in addition to habitat fragmentation driving biodiversity loss, wildlife vehicle collisions represent a serious safety issue for drivers. In fact, there are more than 1 million vehicle collisions involving wildlife each year in our country. 1 million. The good news is that by working together, the federal government, states, and other conservation partners, we are making progress to address both issues. Just yesterday, the Federal Highway Administration announced the first round of grants under the Wildlife Crossing pilot program. We applaud that. It's worth noting that the demand for this funding outweighed the available dollars by 5 times. 5 times. Demonstrating clear demand and need for this important program. And what's more, the pilot program is already catalyzing action at the state and local level. For example, some states are now passing laws and setting aside funding to contribute to this work, and we're encouraged by that. Some states have identified the Wildlife Crossing pilot program as a possible funding source in their planning documents. In the past 2 years, 12 states, I think, including a couple of states that are here represented here today, California, Utah, Massachusetts, and others have passed legislation to support wildlife crossings and committed an estimated $240 million to fund habitat connectivity projects. Other states have been leading on wildlife crossings for some time and are creatively engaging the public in their efforts. For example, Wyoming sells wildlife conservation license plates that help fund the state's work to construct crossings. Businesses even provide discounts to customers who purchase these conservation license plates. So let me close, if I could, by saying that the Federal Highway Administration has an incredible opportunity to partner with others as you work to implement the pilot program. And that includes working with the Department of Interior and its agencies, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, and which we know have a wealth of expertise in prioritizing habitat connectivity. We're interested in learning more today about how the Federal Highway Administration is collaborating with the service, with states and other stakeholders to make the Wildlife Crossing pilot program as successful and impactful as possible. We also hope to hear more today about how the Federal Highway Administration is balancing the habitat connectivity needs of smaller species with larger species and how the agency is considering aquatic connectivity in this new program. With all that in mind, we look forward to hearing from Assistant Administrator Fouch today about his agency's experience getting a wildlife crossings off the ground, both the challenges and as well as the opportunities for going forward. But with that in mind, I want to turn to our ranking member, Senator Capito, whose state, my native states, have a real great interest in setting a great example, I think, in many respects in this area. And thank you for your leadership, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming today and holding this hearing. Director Williams, it's always great to see you. Happy birthday. And I want to also thank you for being always just a phone call away and always eager and ready to help us and our state as we navigate some issues throughout the last several years. So thank you. I'm deeply appreciative of that. Mr. Fouch, I was happy to hear, and you and I talked briefly, that you spent some of your time working at the West Virginia Department of Transportation and living in my hometown city of Charleston, West Virginia. So, you know, that's 5-star for me. So thank you for your continued public service. Today we are discussing, as the chairman has said, the wildlife provisions that were included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. I am pleased that the committee's surface transportation reauthorization was really the foundation of the IIJA. As he said, a lot of that was written right in this room. One of these provisions is the Wildlife Crossings pilot program, the pilot program providing grants for projects designed to reduce collisions between vehicles and wildlife. Last week, the Federal Highway Administration announced grant awards for fiscal years 2022 and 2023. FHWA awarded 19 grants at approximately $110 million, and I'm sure you'll tell us more about that in your statement. I'll be particularly interested in learning about FHWA's plan to expeditiously get those project grant agreements executed. It's one thing to say we're going to grant the money. As we know, there's a pipeline then to move that money forward, so we look forward to that. It's worth noting that the projects funded under the pilot program may be also eligible under some of the existing core highway formula programs, including the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Just a few weeks ago, our Subcommittee on Fisheries, Watery, and Wildlife held a hearing on the challenges and the opportunities to improve migration corridors. At that hearing, we heard a lot about how wildlife crossings can facilitate the migration of big game species, particularly in our western states. We also learned that there are other federal programs and partnerships between federal agencies, states, and the private landowners to help address these challenges. A recent press release from West Virginia's Department of Transportation noted that according to insurance statistics, my state leads the nation in deer strike accidents. I can attest to that since I've had at least 2 in my lifetime, and they're quite frequent. Recently, we spoke with the department staff about this issue. The challenges faced in West Virginia are that due to the unpredictable nature of these deer strikes, we see increases in deer strikes during hunting season, which goes from October through December. The department posts signs and provides information to the public to increase their awareness about this issue. As a native West Virginian, I think we're all pretty aware that this is always a possibility. The department also balances addressing these collisions with other highway safety challenges in the state. As required by federal law, the department uses a data-driven process to develop a plan that guides its investments to improve highway safety. The department also looks for opportunities to help with species conservation. For example, some of the bridges that were built as part of our Quarter H project allows species to continue following their natural path along the ravines. The IIJA also included a program that provides grants for activities that benefit pollinators along roadsides and highway rights-of-way. It is my understanding that FHWA hopes to announce a notice of opportunity for that program in the coming weeks. The supplemental appropriations portion of the IIJA also included funding for various regional programs administered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I look forward to hearing from Director Williams on how implementation of these programs is going. Thank you again, Chairman Carper, and I look forward to the hearing.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. As the ranking member knows, my wife and I took a big road trip over Thanksgiving, and our sons are spread out across the world, and so we decided to go find other members of our family, and our trip took us through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, back down to Ohio, back down through West Virginia, and finally home. And we listened on, we had, my wife's not a big music person, but she somehow found this something on not, I guess, on Spotify, and it was a countdown of the top 100 Beatles songs of all time, as selected by listeners, and which was great fun to hear. And we also, she loves these books on tape, and so we had an opportunity to listen to a book on tape by Steve Jobs, who helped president of the creation of Apple, and served a couple of tours there. The other thing, those were highlights of the trip. One of the sad things on the trip is we saw a number of dead animals on the side of the road. One a very large deer, I think a doe, a female deer, but that still happens too often, and was a bit of a reminder, if you will, that this work is important, and the real consequences to what we're doing here. And sometimes we focus just on the vehicular accidents that occur, and maybe the injuries to drivers and passengers and so forth. But the ones who are dying are, in many cases, God's creations, and we have a moral responsibility to do everything we can to reduce that loss of life. So, with that, this is an important hearing. We're delighted to be able to hear from all of you, especially on a special day, Martha Williams, in your life. This is your life, Martha Williams. You're recognized. Go right ahead. Happy birthday. That's the last I'll mention your birthday, probably.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, and in case...
I just hope your mom's watching today.
I think I forgot to let them know. But,
we'll call her.
But thank you, and I'd like to say that I'm celebrating my 50th, along with the Endangered Species Act, but that may have passed just a couple of years ago. Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Fish and Wildlife Service's implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or as we affectionately call it, BILL. Through BILL, Congress provided $455 million in direct funding to the service to support and implement conservation projects on landscapes across the country. This funding is helping us tackle some of the biggest and most complex challenges facing fish, wildlife, and their habitats. Not only are we making significant strides for conservation, but we're also making a real and positive impact for the people and the local communities that we serve. Through Bill, we are putting locally led collaborative conservation at the center of our work. By listening to communities, we are protecting people, infrastructure, and wildlife habitat. All of this work supports good-paying jobs today and makes investments that will pay out sustained economic and ecosystem dividends far down the road. An example is our National Fish Passage Program, which removes barriers for fish passage, including unused dams. Through this program, the service has worked to reopen over 64,000 miles of upstream habitat since its creation in 1999. As the senator knows, I traveled to West Virginia, where removal of a lowhead dam will help species return while keeping recreationists safe and benefiting the local community. The bill is helping transform and expand this important work. The service is now chairing an interagency fish passage task force that spans 13 agencies, helping to get $2 billion in combined funding, as well as technical expertise to projects on the ground. And I'm proud to share that the task force is hard at work coordinating these investments today in Charleston, South Carolina, as we meet. These resources allow us to support community-led fish passage projects and interagency coordination on a level we simply couldn't match before Bill. These transformational changes aren't limited to the National Fish Passage Program, though. In the Klamath Basin, we've been working for decades with farmers, states, and tribes to address water availability and improve conditions for people and fish. Bill's $162 million investment is allowing us to support large-scale projects that local communities have wanted to see for years. We're installing pumps on wildlife refuges to improve water availability for 20,000 acres of habitat for migratory birds critical to the Pacific Flyway, while also freeing up water for farmers. We're investing tens of millions of dollars to build out Klamath Falls National Fish Hatchery to assist in the recovery of endangered suckers. And we're working with communities to restore areas previously hit by wildfires to improve stream conditions. At Lake Tahoe, using $17 million from Bill, we've partnered with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe to conduct the largest aquatic invasive species project in the basin's history. And that's on top of this basin being really the gold standard for aquatic invasive species intervention. Addressing invasive plants helps improve conditions for native fish, honors our commitment to working with tribes, and preserves Lake Tahoe's recreational value. And Chairman Carper, I've had the delightful opportunity to work closely with you on the Delaware River Basin. Bill funding is supplementing the work we've been doing with communities since 2016 under the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act. In Wilmington, we're improving river health and wildlife habitat while reducing flood risks to nearby neighborhoods. On the coast, we're restoring habitat for red knots and horseshoe crabs, and we're improving public access to parks and trails up and down the basin. I'm extremely proud of the Fish and Wildlife Service's implementation of Bill so far. This funding and the communities and the agencies we are partnering with has transformed how we tackle some of our biggest conservation challenges and has accelerated long-lasting solutions. I'm excited to see what we can accomplish together in the coming years. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Any questions? Any questions? All right.
Any question,
All
Chairman
right.
Carper?
All right. That are pertinent and germane. Okay, we will. In my excitement over your birthday, and
Except for how old I am.
there we go. I failed to actually read a very nice intro that was written by our staffs. I'm just going to say that since I don't want to miss anything on your birthday. But Martha Williams, no stranger to our committee. Director Williams was sworn in as, 23rd director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think in 2022, after serving as principal deputy director since 2021. Is that true? I think that's true. And my introduction goes on to say that you bring extensive background to your role, including on some of the topics that we're discussing today. Having served as the director of the Montana Department of Fish and Wildlife Parks from 2017 and 2020. Are you a native of Montana?
She's from Maryland.
I am a native of Maryland.
Oh, okay, that's good. That works. That's part of Delaware River. That's but you also served as the deputy solicitor for Parks and Wildlife at the Department of Interior. Lifelong outdoor enthusiast and an avid hunter and angler. And we welcome you today. We proceed with your testimony. It'll all be made part of the record. Thank you. Welcome aboard. And Brian, why don't you go ahead and give us your statement, and then we'll come to Brian. Okay. All right, Martha, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Carper.
Yeah, anything else you want to add?
I hope to be able to add lots of stories, which I have learned from you throughout the questions. So
Okay,
thank
good.
you.
All right, Brian, you're up. Thanks.
All right, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act's investments in ecosystem restoration, pollinator-friendly roadside practices, and wildlife crossings. I am pleased to be here today with Director Williams, and I would like to thank Director Williams for the collaboration between FHWA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program is a safety-focused program with the goals of protecting motorists and wildlife by reducing the number of wildlife vehicle collisions and, in carrying out that purpose, improving habitat connectivity for terrestrial and aquatic species. The program represents an unprecedented effort to make roads safer while protecting wildlife as it creates a dedicated source of funding for wildlife crossing projects. At DOT and FHWA, we recognize the importance of wildlife crossing projects. Earlier this year, Secretary Buttigieg visited a wildlife crossing in New Mexico, where they announced details for the new wildlife crossing pilot program. And earlier this week, FHWA was pleased to announce award selections for the first round of funding under this program, announcing $110 million in grants for 19 wildlife crossing projects in 17 states, including 4 Indian tribes. FHWA Administrator Shaylin Batt was in Arizona Department of Transportation for the Interstate 17 Munns Park to Kelly Canyon Wildlife Overpass project. The project will reduce wildlife vehicle collisions along I-17 while increasing habitat connectivity for local species, particularly the elk. Safety is FHWA's #1 priority. The Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program will improve the safety of our nation's roadways by preventing dangerous wildlife vehicle collisions, improving the overall safety of the traveling public, and reducing the economic drain caused by these collisions, while simultaneously supporting species survival and improving habitat connectivity. The awards announced this week do just that. Roadways that cross wildlife habitats create a barrier for animals, and if they try to cross the roadways, can result in wildlife vehicle collisions. The Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program will provide more options for animals to cross busy roads without coming into conflict with traffic, improving habitat connectivity. As required by statute, the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program projects will be administered by the State Departments of Transportation and also by the FHWA's Office of Federal Lands Highway for tribes and federal land management agencies. FHWA has had a long history in supporting these stakeholders with project delivery through our Federal Aid Division offices and our Federal Lands Highway Division offices. This experience makes FHWA well-positioned to administer this important program, and FHWA looks forward to supporting the recipients. In addition to the new Wildlife Crossings pilot program, wildlife crossings are eligible under several federal highway programs, and FHWA has looked for opportunities to highlight these eligibilities. Consistent with our longstanding practice of engaging with stakeholders, FHWA developed the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program Notice of Funding Opportunity after considering input from wildlife conservation groups, foundations, tribal governments, and other relevant federal, state, and local stakeholders. FHWA is also working with these stakeholders to develop guidance, matrices, and best practices regarding wildlife crosses and habitat connectivity. FHWA is committed to continuing its robust consultation with the transportation wildlife conservative community to maximize the impact and programs and activities established under bill. The numerous programs FHWA is implementing also include the Pollinator-friendly practices on roadsides and highway rights-of-way program, a new program to provide grants to eligible entities for activities to benefit pollinators on roadsides and highways right-of-way, including the planting and seeding of native, locally appropriate grasses and wildflowers. Although not within my program area, I know that FHWA is working hard to implement this program. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Good, thanks. I'm sitting here, we know Ms. Williams is from Montana originally, well, Maryland originally?
Originally Montana, Chairman, but really I lived in Montana for over 30 years.
That's a long time. Where are you from?
I grew up in the southwestern part of Virginia.
Where?
In Richlands, Virginia.
How far is that from Danville?
Sir?
How far is that from Danville?
From Danville, that's probably a 2.5-hour trip.
That's where we grew up. My sister and I grew up there. I'm listening to your accent. I think I've heard that one before. So,
yes.
As a kid growing up. In any event, you've been in your current role for what, a couple of months?
Yes.
Any first impressions?
It's a wonderful program at Federal Highways, and some of my first impressions is the great, I guess, stakeholder relationships we have with our federal land management agencies, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service. Just our collaboration and how we work together has been really impressive.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what you were doing at FHA for the last, 25 years?
Yeah, for the last 25 years, I've been involved with many programs with Federal Highways. I started out, my very first assignment with Federal Highways was with Federal Lands, where I had a project that I helped manage in Yellowstone National Park. So you can imagine starting out in a program where your first assignment is to live in Yellowstone National Park for 6 months.
Tough assignment.
That was something, and so that was a great experience.
Yeah, that's great. Let's see. Let me ask you a couple of other questions now. How has the Federal Highway Administration consulted with other agencies and state experts in standing up the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program? And how does the Federal Highway Administration plan to continue leveraging this expertise going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Senator,
Sure.
for that question. FHWA, we've hosted several webinars and listening sessions for the Wildlife Crossing Program with our stakeholders. We held 2 webinars. One was for the general public and one just for tribes to assist us in applications and the application process and answering questions that might be pertaining to the Notice of Funding opportunity. We also held 2 listening sessions, one for the general public and one specifically for tribes as well, to capture feedback on the application process so that we can approve it in the next round when we have that in fiscal year 24. As we have worked on these, we have collaborated with our stakeholders, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and conservation groups. We actually received several letters from non-government organizations, conservation groups, hunting and angling groups, as well as letters from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife on the ways we can implement this program and meeting with them to have those discussions about how the best way to implement these programs. We also have several other provisions in bill that we're going to be working on as well, including best practices and training and development for these programs, and we'll continue to collaborate with all these stakeholders as we move forward and working on these.
Okay, good, thanks. Director Williams, Would you take a couple of minutes, maybe share with us some details about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's efforts to address habitat connectivity and any ideas that you might have for Federal Highway Administration as it continues to implement the pilot program?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Carper. I think that connectivity, corridors, and these projects are all very important. So through the bipartisan infrastructure law at the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've been very focused on ecosystem restoration and how that relates to connectivity. So an example of that would be the Fish Passage Program that's really focused on connecting that fish habitat, and by doing so is providing real impacts to communities, jobs, flood safety, water security, and recreational safety as well, including addressing fish. I bring the Fish Passage Program up as an example of connectivity because I believe that the work the Fish and Wildlife Service has done with the Fish Passage Program in coordinating with over 13 other agencies that are much larger than the Fish and Wildlife Service and have much larger budgets, we have found our superpower at the Fish and Wildlife Service of bringing together and coordinating with other agencies so that we all do better work on the ground and sequence that work. Translating then that to wildlife crossings, they are incredibly important, as you have learned through the hearing on corridors and migration. These crossings are critical to so many different species, and our work in coordination with my colleague and our colleagues at Federal Highways is also important, that we share our knowledge, our expertise, and we coordinate. In this instance, we did coordinate early on, but then also the Fish and Wildlife Service applied for one of these grants, and we're very pleased to receive one at Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge for ocelot crossing. So the crossings, migration corridors, and connectivity are all three very important to the work the Fish and Wildlife Service does.
Good. Thank you. Senator Capito.
Thank you. And Director Williams, I want to follow up from where that last question was. I guess my first question was going to be, are wildlife crossings eligible under existing interior programs? And I think you answered that, but if you would just kind of flesh that out.
Thank you for asking that, Senator Capito, because wildlife crossings, this program through Bill is incredibly important to the Fish and Wildlife Service and Interior for wildlife crossings, because while we have other programs and can put money toward crossings, we use those programs for other services as well, and the funding available is very small compared to what's available through this grant program that's specific to wildlife crossings only.
Okay, and when we talked earlier in the week, and I appreciate the phone call, and you mentioned it again, I expressed a lot of surprise that a federal agency was getting a grant from another federal agency. Sounds a little conflicted to me. How do you see that from your perspective? And I understand, do you review these applications? Or they're all reviewed over at Highways?
So very good question, Senator Capito. And actually, after speaking with you, I looked into this further and had some similar questions. This is why we did not consult more with Federal Highways as you were putting the program together. We consulted some, but we do not sit on the grant review process because we would not want to review where we have applications for the grants themselves. So we helped coordinate early on, but after that have been very careful to leave space between that and not seem like we're looking at our own grant proposals.
Right. So, Mr. Fouch, let's talk about that. Were there other agencies, federal agencies, that applied for these grants of the 19, or is that the only? Is that one of the 19 that you talked about?
Yeah, these grants were available to all federal land management agencies. So it was available to other agencies. And
Did
like-
anybody else apply? Any other federal agency that you can recall? Or were they granted? Maybe that's a fairer question since,
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife was the grant, the only grant for them, for a federal agency. The National Park Service, I do recall there were some applications from the National Park Service, but none of those were awarded.
okay. That sounds strange to you? A federal agency giving grants to a federal agency? As an appropriator, that sounds strange to me because I'm like, well, why don't we just appropriate into the pocket that the director would use rather than have one federal agency apply to another federal agency?
If I could just interrupt, I think well, I don't want to prolong this, but the idea, why does this make sense? You know, it was just common. My dad used to talk to me, my sister, all the time. Just use some common sense. Maybe this is a common sense situation, but I think the senator's raising a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so we talked too about interagency coordination. So, Mr. Fouch, what other, you mentioned a couple, Park Service, is Forest Service somebody else that you coordinate with? What other agencies are you in a coordinating capacity as you're moving through these programs? So that we're not duplicating here, yeah.
Yes, of course, and thank you, Senator, for that question. So we've sent out invitations to consult on developing our products, and with the Wildlife Crossing Program, with the transportation wildlife communities, we're talking about members of tribes we've consulted with, state DOTs we've consulted with, state fish and wildlife agencies, and again, we can get consultation back from them on the notice of funding, but the other products that we are working on that doesn't have the interest of them applying for a grant. We're working on those products with agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but also we're talking to colleges and universities as well to get feedback on this program. ASHTO is another organization we're working with because best practices is a big part of this program as we move forward with. So that's a few of the agencies that we've been reaching out to.
Let's talk about, I mentioned this in my opening statement on the the application projects and actually getting the projects out, not just out the door, but out the door and fully constructed. So what are you doing to streamline that?
Thank you, Senator, for that.
Project grant agreements.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, as you know, yesterday we made the announcement for the awards. And some of the things that we're doing there is that a lot of these projects are going to be administered by the state DOTs and so forth. So a lot of the award agreement templates that we put together with these groups, we are streamlining those efforts to help us get those awards out the door quicker. We have also established some programs within our agency. We've established a discretionary grant program team just to help us in administering these grants quicker as well. So those are just a few of the things that we've been doing to help streamline the process.
And then is the accountability on the back end in terms of how long it's taken? Were you able to do the project that you said you were going to do? All of that, I'm sure you do that sort of accountability as the projects are finishing.
Yes, Senator, that's correct.
Well, I have a deer that comes in my yard all the time and eats my hosta. So, you know, anything I can tell that deer to get out of my yard and cross back into the neighbor's yard, I really need that. Thank you.
Elizabeth Grace Mabry is sitting over my left shoulder. She's a senior member of our staff on the majority side. And her birthday was yesterday, but she's written a note to me in response to I thought the appropriate questions raised by Senator Capito in the last couple of minutes. But here, I'll just read it directly what she has said. She said there's a list of eligible applicants in the bipartisan infrastructure law. I see you nodding your head, Martha. She goes, the note goes on to say federal agencies are explicitly listed as eligible, explicitly listed in the law. This was strongly supported by stakeholders who view federal land management agencies as critical partners. So thank you, Elizabeth Grace. And with that, I'd like to introduce Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman.
Take it away. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to you both. Director Williams, thanks for bringing up the red knot and horseshoe crab situation. I have traveled to Delaware to see the red knot land, and the theory of their timing is that they get there in time for the horseshoe crabs to put billions of eggs into the water for them to feed on. It's quite a remarkable achievement. They fly direct from Brazil to Delaware Bay, which is a heck of a flight for a little
We like to
bird.
say it's nonstop.
Yeah, nonstop. And then fuel up on the horseshoe crabs and then go on up to their Arctic breeding grounds. So it's a remarkable little bird, and the danger is that climate change dislocates the timing of their arrival and the horseshoe crabs so that when they get there, the food supply they need isn't there. But I'm glad that you mentioned it because it's a coastal issue, and my experience has been that federal government agencies tend to favor upland, inland, and freshwater projects over coastal projects. The Land and Water Conservation Fund sends considerably more funding per capita to non-coastal states than to coastal states. And within the money that's sent to coastal states, a great deal of that funding is for inland, upland, and freshwater projects, not for coastal projects. So for those of us like me from the ocean state, what can you say to reassure us that coastal and saltwater projects will be treated fairly and not ignored in favor of inland, upland, and freshwater projects?
Thank you for that question, Senator Whitehouse. And since I've had the opportunity to testify before this committee, it's a topic that I've learned from you and I have paid attention to, and traveled to your fair state of Rhode Island to...
I know, you traveled around Statuesque Point. Beautiful place.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And I was so pleased to see the project there of building an accessible viewpoint with the Great American Outdoors Act funding. And it's an incredible place that demonstrates very much the value of our coasts and tidelands to resiliency with climate change moving forward.
But smoothing out an existing trail and improving a small existing wooden viewpoint kind of makes my point that we're really not getting much in coastal stuff if that's the best we have to offer.
Senator Whitehouse, fair asking that question. I have been paying attention to our coastal program and putting more resources and support into that program that in some respects mirrors the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program that is more upland focused than the coastal program. So have very much been focused on the coastal program and restoration in these tidal areas. But specific, your point is well taken as far as specific projects in your state. But I can say that many of these bill projects are focused on the coastal areas and resiliency there. But let's work together, I hope, to do more in your state of Rhode Island.
Yeah, I hope you'll just keep an eye on the coastal versus inland imbalance because it's tiresome for those of us who are in coastal states.
I will, thank you.
My time is short, so let me ask these as two questions for the record. Methane leaks are a very significant contributor to climate change, extremely dangerous. The Biden administration has set up a methane task force led by the Department of Justice to allow for rapid response. When methane leaks are detected, they've contracted with NASA so that they can get real-time data about from satellites about where methane leaks are happening. I'd like to find out about what your participation is in the methane task force and where you see that leading. And the second is that the OMB some weeks ago announced that the social cost of carbon emerging from EPA through the methane regulation was to be applied throughout all the agencies of government, including your own. And I would like to see what your plan is for implementing the social cost of carbon per the directive from OMB, now that the EPA rule has been properly announced and is now regulatory law. So with that, if you could get back to me in writing, since my time has expired, I'd appreciate it.
I look forward to doing that, Senator Whitehouse. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse, thanks for keeping those red knots in mind. That's one of the wonders of nature, the way they do
Aren't
that.
they?
Just amazing.
They
Tiny
really
little
are.
birds fly thousands and thousands of miles. Stop for lunch in Delaware and on those horseshoe crab eggs, and then they're on their way.
They actually morph as they fly.
Yeah.
It's astonishing.
Okay. Director Williams, a question or two, if I could, on the Delaware River Basin program. The Congress authorized, as you know, the Delaware River Basin program back in, I want to say 2015, 2016, and began providing appropriations about 5 years ago, and I think in 2018. This non-regulatory ecosystem restoration program has been, by almost any standard, a really tremendous success. It brings together federal, state, and local agencies together with conservation partners to implement priority restoration activities within the Delaware River Basin. These projects, which improve, among other things, improve water quality, conserve wildlife habitat, increase coastal resiliency, and they benefit our environment, they benefit our communities, they benefit our economy as well. Question. Director Williams, would you share with us your perspective, please, on why the Delaware River Basin program is such a great model for ecosystem restoration? How has the additional funding Congress provided through the bipartisan infrastructure law enhanced the program's success?
Thank you, Senator Carper, for that question, and I hope that I learned from you in my time. And so think about this, try to weave stories into my responses more than I may be used to. And so I think of a day.
I think I told you once, I asked Bill Clinton why he was such an effective communicator. And he said to me, I'd heard him speak when I was governor 100 times. And he said to me, 5, 6, 7 years ago when he spoke, and I said, why are you such an effective communicator? He says, I tell stories.
Yeah.
And he said, I weave them together, and I use self-deprecating humor. And so I try to do that from time to time. Maybe too much. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Senator Carper. So I think when I think about the Delaware River Basin and the Delaware River Basin Conservation Act, I think about a day when I visited Wilmington this past August.
Wilmington, Delaware, not North Carolina.
Wilmington, Delaware, yes, in this instance. And when I arrived off the train, I took the train up, and when I arrived, I walked along the Wilmington waterfront with a member of my staff who I had not met before. And that member
One of the proudest things we did when I was governor, we transformed industrial wasteland into the beautiful waterfront that it is today. So proud.
And well, so I couldn't agree more. She commented about having grown up there and how much that revitalization has benefited that community and how much that meant to her. And then at the end of the walk, we walked to the DuPont Environmental Education Center, which showcased then the beauty of the natural marsh and the impact of that coastal, the restoration and on that coastal resilience. And then we were there for a grant announcement, and I saw firsthand how representatives from local government, a teacher, a number of teachers, an environmental group, and the neighborhoods, how engaged they were in the process in the grant making and the celebration of those grants. And they themselves held up this program as an example of what the federal government can do when we strive for our mission of working in a collaborative way and having these real investments. And then the impact of the day didn't end there. We had the chance to go to take a boat ride on the Christina River and see the grant projects from the water and to see how the Riverfront Development Corporation had used the program to incorporate ecological benefits into their economic development planning. And then to see that mix, but then also we saw pollinator gardens that were being installed by more than 20 interfaith congregations to increase wildlife habitat and pollinators and access for recreation for their communities. So what I saw, Chairman Carper, was the benefit of this program, but also the benefit of the investment of Bill in working to restore ecosystems that then also had real and tangible impacts to the health and safety of the local communities. So what I learned in Wilmington that day and in this area also gives me hope for these bipartisan infrastructure law investments elsewhere in the country. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that memory with us. I'd been governor, Senator Capito, for about a month or two, and former governors showed up on my schedule and to come and visit me in our Wilmington office. Brought with them the former president of the University of Delaware, and they said they brought with them a bunch of architect renderings of what an industrial wasteland could look like along the Christina River, where the train station is, and they said it could really be a marvelous place. And they showed me all these architect renderings, and I was just blown away. Riverfront, it's beautiful. We used to have bodies. We find bodies in the river and other things, but it was just badly polluted. During World War II, 10,000 people worked along the riverfront there, not far from Biden Station, and mostly women building ships to help win the war. But when the war was over, the place went to sea, and it was just, people never even went down there, didn't even know there was a river there. And the former Governor Russ Peterson, great environmentalist. He later ended up heading up CEQ under, I think, President Nixon and President Ford. But anyway, they presented this incredible transformation in these architect renderings, and I was blown away, and I said to him, Governor Peterson, I said, who's going to do this? Who's going to make this happen? And they said, you are. And I said, why me? And he said, because you're the governor, and this is what governors do. And I said, well, you're going to help me. And they did. It's been just a great source of joy from all. Senator Capito, you want to jump in here?
Yes, thank you. I have one final question for Director Williams, and we've talked a lot about the Elkins Field Office in West Virginia, but it's my understanding that they have a detailee from the U.S. Forest Service. Your staff has indicated that this has been very helpful in managing the backlog of Section 7 consultations, but that the process to execute the memorandum of understanding to secure a detailee can be very lengthy and complex. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations as how those processes could be expedited.
Thank you, Senator Capito, and I also want to just recognize my appreciation in working with you on these issues and your leadership. It's been very helpful in highlighting and bringing forth the challenges at the Fish and Wildlife Service, where we have had declining capacity in staff and yet ever increasing numbers of consultations coming in. And we've tried to streamline through the IPAC system, which really has made an enormous difference. In some instances, it's been 98% of the consultations can go through IPAC, and they can do it on the computer and move on. For the remaining consultations, which is your question, how do we streamline having the staff there? And as you know, we've done that through a combination of ways. We would like transfer authority because that helps us with federal agencies, and it may have taken a little bit to get in place, but they can last longer. And it also helps to have those, have people from the agencies we're working with then know the process. So one way is through the transfer authority, which we are seeking, and then the other is through these reciprocal agreements, which we have used often with external parties. So those are two tools that we use, but I would say if we had better capacity within the Fish and Wildlife Service to have adequate staff for consultations, we could do more as well.
So let's talk about the transfer authority issue. Is that transfer, tell me how that works, the transfer authority issue within your Fish and Wildlife.
Well, Senator,
Well, it's not working, I know, because you don't have the transfer authority now, but how would that work?
yes, thank you, Senator Capito. And I was smiling because I realize the challenge, of moving money from one federal agency to another.
Right.
This would set up an agreement with another federal agency where we have the agreement ahead of time to have staff working on consultations for that agency.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
I'm being summoned to come to another where we have other committees meeting at the same time. We all serve on a bunch of different committees. The Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs is meeting right now. They're voting, and they need me to come and vote. I'll be back very shortly. Thank you, Senator Capito.
So Senator Padilla, you're up next.
Thank you. Glad to see this committee continue important conversations for the benefit of our nation's wildlife. As Ranking Member Senator Capito mentioned earlier, Senator Lummis and I held a hearing in our subcommittee on fisheries, water, and wildlife last month, I should say. And we had a chance to demonstrate the bipartisan and widespread support that there is for wildlife crossings, wildlife corridors, and efforts to restore habitat. So I'm glad to continue this conversation here at the full committee level. Before I get into questions, Director Williams, happy birthday. I appreciate you mentioning Lake Tahoe in your remarks earlier, and I have a question on Lake Tahoe, but before I get to that, I wanted to talk about the Klamath River Basin. As you know well, Congress provided the Fish and Wildlife Service with $162 million for restoration activities in the Klamath Basin via the bipartisan infrastructure law. This funding provides an opportunity to protect wildlife habitat and restore the precious basin ecosystem. Can you just spend a minute talking about how the service has holistically used these funds to maximize restoration and water resilience benefits?
Thank you for that question, Senator Padilla, because I do believe the investment through the bipartisan infrastructure law in the Klamath Basin, it's a perfect example of how it has allowed us to look at the more holistic challenges that occur in the basin. So rather than it being piecemeal in the past, we're now able to look at the ecosystem restoration of the Klamath Basin as a whole, so that we can develop ecosystem restoration that supports salmon, suckers, agriculture in the basin, and then also our refuges.
And can you describe a little bit more about how working with fellow federal agencies as well as state agencies, tribal leaders, and other stakeholders has ensured that our efforts are not piecemeal but part of a bigger vision?
Indeed, Senator Padilla, one of the benefits of having this investment is we've used it to pull together, absolutely working with the tribes in the Klamath Basin, often with very different interests. They are not a monolith. They each have their own concerns and have been engaged in the Klamath have lived there for time immemorial. So it's allowed us to pull together the tribes. We've worked very closely with the state. We work very closely with irrigation districts. We work very closely with local governments, et cetera. So we have used this investment to convene partners to recognize what's before us. I think before now, we have had to work on a year-by-year basis and plan out for that year. Now we're able to think longer term and to really address the water scarcity in the basin.
Wonderful. Also grateful to the service for your commitment to restoring our beloved Lake Tahoe. In addition to protecting Lake Tahoe from the threat of wildfires, it's been a big focus and emphasis in recent years, but for many years, removing and preventing aquatic invasive species in the lake has been one of the highest ecological priorities for the region. Now, the Lake Tahoe Aquatic Invasive Species Program, which received $3 million in the infrastructure law, is a collaborative effort between the service, the Washoe Tribe of California and Nevada, and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. So similar to our conversation with the Klamath, Can you speak to the benefits of meaningful collaboration among stakeholders, state and tribal leaders on this particular program?
Yes, thank you for that question again. And as I mentioned earlier in my opening statement, Lake Tahoe has often been held up as the gold standard in aquatic invasive species, but this investment from the bipartisan infrastructure law in Lake Tahoe has allowed us to really focus on aquatic invasive species prevention, and we've done it. And as is consistent with all of this bill funding, we've used our role as support. We're not pushing a certain agenda other than ecosystem restoration. Instead, we've pulled the community together, including the tribes here and the Tahoe Regional Authority and other partners, to hear what they feel their immediate needs are, and then support that going forward. So in this instance, there are examples of permanent aquatic invasive species checkpoint stations, which is so helpful to know that they are there permanently and that the tribes are partnered in that. And then this is really important not only for Lahontan cutthroat lake trout, but it's also important, obviously, for the economy of Lake Tahoe to keep these invasive species out, or at least have early detection.
Great. Thank you so much. Look forward to our continuing work. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Certainly. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and welcome. And to my colleague for California, thank you for sending me the article about it being peak time for counting the monarchs on the Santa Cruz area of the California coast. I had a chance to go down to Pismo Beach, another location for when monarchs gather. And the western monarch had declined to less than 1% of its traditional numbers some 20, 30 years ago. In fact, we were down to just a couple thousand several years ago. And it's really at verge of extinction. Now, we're now back up to a couple 100,000, but still a tiny fraction of the traditional monarchs. And it's certainly a reflection of, well, in part, climate change, in part, the much increased use of pesticides affecting the monarchs, and their long journey with multiple generations going north and a single generation going south. Back in December of, well, let's see, it wasn't December 22, it was June 2022, I partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service to sponsor a monarch summit for us to become aware of these different factors, bring all the experts together. And one of the things that came up at that point was Fish and Wildlife Service announcing the creation of the Center for Pollinator Conservation, which I strongly applaud. It now has a director, Nicole Alt. It has been hosting a series of workshops, very much appreciated. I think there's one more next week. And so I wanted to express appreciation that this is underway, and ask if there are some early successes that you'd like to highlight related to the Center for Pollinator Conservation.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, for your leadership on pollinators and helping us really put together these summits, but also the ensuing Center for Pollinator Conservation. And as you mentioned, the leader, Nicole Ott, has been terrific, and we are using the center more and more. We're really learning how to build it out and build out how we use them, and we need the center. So as you mentioned, well, the Pollinator Conservation Center is focused on 3 areas: applied science, and I say that very purposely because it's applied science, not science for science sake, but learning how to apply it for pollinator conservation, collaboration, and engagement. So as you mentioned, we've been working with the Monarch Joint Venture and many others, but the next and last workshop, I believe, will be next week. And from that, I am looking forward to what they're calling an action plan that will really finalize what steps will next and who will do them. But in addition to that, I just convened a leadership summit for monarchs in Minneapolis using the Center for Pollinator Conservation to pull it together and to recognize in concert with the other federal agencies, how do we really make a difference for pollinator conservation well beyond what the Fish and Wildlife Service can do alone. And that center is very helpful in pulling those efforts together.
Well, thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing what that action plan looks like. We're understanding better some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. And one of the opportunities is to do a lot more planting of pollinator-friendly plants, both for nectar and, in the case of monarchs, milkweed for the caterpillars. And I wanted to turn to you, Administrator Fouch. In your testimony, you state that FHWA is working to implement a program as expeditiously as possible. The program you're referring to is the pollinator-friendly practices on roadsides and highway right-of-way. This began with a conversation I had with Lamar Alexander, former senator, whose state had developed a pollinator plot program along its state highways. And it seemed like, well, what we've done, what he did in his home state or what his state did, seems like we could replicate. I first asked Administrator Bott about the status of this program in June in this very room, and I was told it would be expeditiously stood up, and yet still no sign of progress. This isn't that complicated. $3 million was allocated. I think under even a continuing resolution, we'd have another $3 million. Grants limited to $150,000 to enable groups to establish significant pollinator-friendly plots along highways. Sometimes it's just unacceptably slow in terms of how quickly the gears of government turn. And we are really facing a pollinator Armageddon. I mean, we have lost such a huge volume of insects over my lifetime. Many people will refer to it in different ways, but I know a number of folks have told me they can identify with the experience I had of when I drove with my family when I was a little kid. Every single stop, we had to clean off massive amounts of insects off the windshield. Now, if there's one insect on the windshield, it's a surprise. I mean, we've lost a massive amount. Why can't we speed up this strategy of establishing pollinator plots along the highways? Or tell me that you're now happy to inform me that it's all in gear, it's all designed, it's going to be rolled out, you're taking action, and we'll see results.
Thank you for that question, Senator. And yes, this is a very important program. And FHWA has been working expeditiously to implement this program. We do expect to get the notice of funding out soon. That program is handled in our Environment and Planning office, and that's outside of my office. But as far as the status and progressing forward, we can continue to provide you updates for that.
It's a totally unacceptable answer. Now, it's outside your jurisdiction, so in that sense, it's an acceptable answer. But you're evaluating what the other unit is doing, saying it's expeditious. It's not expeditious. And happy words about someday we'll, it's expeditious, something will happen soon. No, the type of answers we need are, here are the 5 things steps we've taken. Here are what our remaining challenges are. Here's the timeline for getting them done. That's the type of answer we want to hear when we ask about the development of program, not some vague, we're expeditiously working, we're sincerely undertaking, all those words. Those words mean nothing. Where are the action steps? Where do they stand? Why can't we see this roll out? Are there obstacles we need to solve? And when it comes to programs like this, given that we have states that have undertaken programs like this, it should be able to get done. So I want to send back, even though it's not your jurisdiction, I want to send back the strongest possible. This is the type of program that can be implemented. Please, next time I hear about it, tell me the steps taken, the remaining steps being taken, the schedule to roll it out, when that's happening, or if there are obstacles, what they are, so we can try to solve them.
Yeah, we'll be glad to get that information to your office.
Mr. Fouch, you were, Senator Merkley was not in the room when I asked you how long you'd been in your position, and how long has it been? So for like a month or so. So next time, we'll expect more.
Mr. Chairman, point taken that this was outside your jurisdiction, but I'm really just sending a message back of general frustration.
I can do that, sir.
Thank you.
All right, good. Message sent. All right, Senator Ricketts, good morning, how are you?
Good morning, do well. Thank you, Mr.
Great
Chairman.
to see you. You're recognized.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and Ranking Member Capito. The 30 by 30 initiative by the Biden administration aims to preserve 30% of the land and waters in the United States by the year 2030. This is far from a new or novel overreach. Since the Wilderness Act of 1968, Congress has passed 120 new laws, resulting in the creation of 803 wilderness areas, totaling approximately 117 million acres. During the Obama and Biden administration, a precedent was set for the misuse of the national monument designations. The Antiquities Act was employed to unilaterally designate or expand 34 national monuments covering an extensive 553,550,000 acres of land and water. Building on this legacy, the Biden administration has continued this effort. They've issued 5 new monument designations, and they've effectively locked up nearly 2 million acres of land. Ms. Williams, the last time you were in front of this committee, you were unable to specify the congressional act that authorizes the 30 by 30's egregious land grab. And that's because there is no congressional authority. There is still no clear definition of conservation. It's led to uncertainty and instability for private landowners. The administration has consistently neglected to specify whether working lands, conservation, multiple use, and active management will be considered as part of the conservation criteria for 30 by 30. Numerous congressional oversight inquiries have gone unanswered. It's contributed to a state of confusion and uncertainty regarding the 30 by 30 initiative. True conservation is sustaining land for working land purposes. It is my belief that private landowners are the best stewards of our lands. Nebraskans are a prime example of this. Nebraskans have demonstrated that landowners can effectively balance the productive use of their land with conservation efforts. Nebraska is a national leader for acres utilizing no-till practices on farms. Our agricultural producers are voluntarily making decisions. They don't need the federal government coming in and telling them how to do their business. These stakeholders and communities should instead be utilized for their knowledge. Studies have shown that critical habitat designations can reduce land values by up to 30%. Landowners are then left with no compensation. Rural communities that rely on land values for property taxes, and these funds then support education, infrastructure, and other essential services. But when you reduce that, obviously that reduces the local community's ability to be able to provide those services. A prime example of this is what's happened to communities following the listing of the northern spotted owl as an endangered species by Fish and Wildlife Service. The critical habitat designation was followed by declining timber sales. Because of federal bureaucrats' unilateral action, rural counties saw their tax base was limited by the growing amount of federal land. As a result, Congress had to pass the Secure Rural Schools program. A portion of the Forest Service funds generated through grazing, timber production, and other special use permits are distributed to eligible counties. These communities now rely on these funds to maintain local roads and schools, all because federal bureaucrats actioned to cut their tax base. While programs like Secure Rural Schools provide important support for rural communities, the fact remains that this was a solution that had to be created because of a government-fabricated problem. Inflation has hit rural communities harder than others. The federal government butting out and allowing them to responsibly manage their land and natural resources will allow communities to be more resilient in depressed economic times. These stakeholders and communities should be utilized for their knowledge and passion for the land, not held to the fire by federal oversight. So, Ms. Williams, how does the service collaborate with private landowners to incorporate their perspectives and local knowledge into conservation strategies rather than imposing top-down measures?
Thank you, Senator Ricketts, for that question, and this is work that I have long been engaged in well before this position. The Fish and Wildlife Service, I can give an example with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, where we work with ranchers and partners to hear what they want in their location, and then provide technical expertise to apply for grants that would work for them. There's an example of how we work with private landowners in your state of Nebraska, where through the bipartisan infrastructure law with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, we worked with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission using $4 million in the bipartisan infrastructure law grant funding to implement just what you have asked, voluntary incentive-based program to promote vibrant grasslands with ranching communities. So I would answer that we have long understood that the best conservation is that is locally led, where we learn from the community, and when we're working with private landowners, absolutely voluntary and incentive-based.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you for a good question, and I thought for a thoughtful answer. If you have another question, you're welcome to give. Okay, thanks. Thanks again for joining us today. I have a couple more questions. One or two of our members are trying to get here from other committee meetings, so we'll see if they can do that. I hope so. My next question deals with working with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and Fish and Wildlife Service partners with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to administer some of its grant programs, including programs funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've heard very positive feedback from stakeholders about working with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. My question, Director Williams, would be, how does partnering with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation expedite the disbursement of grant funding, and how does it help leverage private investments to match those federal dollars? Does the Fish and Wildlife Service still retain a role in grant administration when it's partnering with the foundation?
Thank you, Chairman Carper, for that question, and I think this follows nicely from Senator Ricketts' question as well, in that the Fish and Wildlife Service has long partnered with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, a very important partner to us. And what the value that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation brings to the table is that they can coordinate with other federal agencies and can have more one-stop shopping, so that where they're working with us, but also these other federal agencies, bring in also local partners and leverage money that typically when we work with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, they're able to leverage the federal money to get more conservation on the ground, and they're very adept at working with local communities to build that collaborative conservation that we're all talking about. So an example, Senator, in your backyard for the Delaware River Basin, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation has leveraged more than one-to-one for each federal dollar that goes through them for these ecosystem restoration projects.
I think I'm going to ask another related question to this. Not everybody who's in the room or maybe watching us remotely know about the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, its genesis, where did it come from, how long has it been around? For somebody who knows nothing about it, how would you describe it? Give us a little primer on it, please.
Thank you. I mean, it's a statutorily created foundation to aid both the Fish and Wildlife Service and also National Marine Fisheries Service, NOAA. So we are its two primary partners, but they partner well beyond the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, and it was instrumental in working on the oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and building out the ecosystem restoration efforts in that area. They work across the country and somewhat globally as well. And it's have the pleasure of sitting on the board and working with those board members. It's very well run, it's very efficient, and they have terrific expertise.
Good answer. Thanks very much. You serve on the board
I do, Chairman.
from day one in your job?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Different kind of questions, but one that deals with threatened and endangered species. I'm going to start off, Mr. Fouch, with you and ask you to respond to the question first, and then we'll turn back to Miss Williams. But maybe I'll flip that, and I'll sort of start with you, Director Williams. Your agency is tasked with recovering our nation's threatened and endangered species, as we know. Mr. Fouch, your agency reported, I think in 2008, about 15 years ago, that wildlife vehicle collisions are a major threat to the survival of at least 21 species. Let me say that again. That's pretty eye-opening. Your agency reported in 2008 that wildlife vehicle collisions are a major threat to the survival of at least 21 species. And I'm going to ask both of you, and Ms. Williams, you can lead off if you want, but would you both share with us how the bipartisan infrastructure law investments in ecosystem restoration and habitat connectivity will help imperiled species? If you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, for that question, in part because it's very nice to have an opportunity to highlight the real impact that the bipartisan infrastructure law investments have made, not only in habitat connectivity for wildlife crossings, but also and recovering species, but also for people in their communities. What the bill investment has done, it's allowed us to switch our approach to take more of a whole ecosystem approach to conservation rather than just individual projects. We're able to really address these long-standing issues. And the examples for each of the areas of the bipartisan infrastructure law money that comes through the Fish and Wildlife Service, whether it's the sagebrush ecosystem, the Klamath Basin, or the Fish Passage Program, it really has allowed us to work with tribes, states, many other partners to make sure that we're bringing everyone together to address these long-standing issues like water availability that help for these ecosystem functions that then also help the community, flooding, water availability. So it's been transformative for the way in which the service can address recovery of species because we can better address the root causes in the habitat connectivity. And that's been a game changer for us.
Good, thank you. Before I turn to Senator Sullivan, I'm going to ask Mr. Fouch to respond to the same question. If you would, how does the bipartisan infrastructure law investment in ecosystem restoration and habitat connectivity help with imperiled species?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The report that you discussed is as part of the bill and our requirements under bill. We'll be expanding upon that report, taking a look at best practices and things that we can expand upon. Also, too, in expanding that report, Bill is asking us to take a look at design and implementation guidelines and also to provide guidelines on wildlife fencing, underpasses, overpasses, and so forth that help that. And in doing that, we'll be collaborating with our stakeholders and talking about that as we complete that.
All right, good, thanks. I may come back to this after Senator Sullivan's asked this question. I may come back and follow up on this a little bit more before we adjourn. Senator Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for...
I held people here as long as I could.
Thanks for tapping.
A couple people tried to get out of the room. I wouldn't let them.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And Mr. Fouch and Director Williams, thanks for being here. Director Williams, appreciate the phone call yesterday. By the way, I don't know if it's been announced, and maybe I shouldn't, but I hear is it a special day for you? Yes, is that true? This is your birthday present. You get to answer hard questions, so happy birthday.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan.
I hope in the next 5 minutes I don't ruin it, but
I've been a bipartisan happy birthday.
There you go. You got it now from the chairman. So anyways, let me just very quickly kind of get a couple commitments from you. These are easy ones. From our conversation yesterday, first, can you just commit yes or no? And I think these are all easy yeses. We'll start this questioning easy. To get together with the key stakeholders, Tlingit Haida, other Native groups, Southeast fishermen, to find consensus on this very longstanding, challenging issue on co-management standards for sea otters. Can we get your commitment to work with me on that in all of them collectively?
Senator Sullivan, I was a bit worried of what your easy yes would be, but indeed, yes.
Yeah, okay. And then on the Migratory Bird Co-Management Council, you know, the issue I raised with Alaska Native handicraft
Yes.
issues, can I get your commitment to work with me on that one too?
Yes.
And then the Wood Bison Recovery Plan and coordinating efforts more deeply with my office and more importantly, my office, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have these charts. I think I've mentioned you. Now, Jake here on my team, this is going to be a little tough, but this is a chart I gave to the President of the United States in a meeting I had with him a number of months ago, but what's referred to as the last frontier lockup, 56 executive orders and executive actions from the Biden administration singularly focused on Alaska. 56. Mr. Chairman, you know, I've raised this a lot. The executive orders and actions keep growing, and I just think it's completely unfair. I respectfully said it to the President. I was in the Oval Office. I'm going to be respectful, but I said, Mr. President, you know, if a Republican administration came in and issued 56 executive orders and executive actions singularly focused on shutting down Delaware's economy and access to lands, none of these we want, right? Very few we were consulted on. I said, with all due respect, sir, you'd be on the Senate floor raising hell every damn day. So I'm not going to raise hell here, but this is an outrage. It needs to stop. Mr. Chairman, maybe someday we can have a hearing on this. But Director Williams, I did compliment you on your use of indigenous knowledge on the Southeast Alaska Wolf Endangered Species Act decision, and I want to thank you on that. You can put those down, Jake. But what I'm concerned about is the lack of consultation with Alaska Natives, particularly Alaska Natives who live in the area. Now I'm talking North Slope Borough, National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, ANWR. As you and I talked about, there's been no consultation with these great Americans on huge issues. And, you know, they've tried to meet with Secretary Holland 7 times. She doesn't meet with them. This is the borough elected representatives, the tribal representatives, and the Alaska Native Corp representatives. Look, it's an insult. It's an outrage. You and I had a long discussion about this. They were in town 2 weeks ago, held a big press conference. You know, their voices are being canceled. They listened to lower 48 environmental groups, what our Alaska Native people call the eco-colonialists. Eco-colonialists, meaning these lower 48 groups come up, condescendingly pat the Alaska Native people who've been living in Alaska for thousands of years on the head, tell them what's good for them. It's an outrage. So those people get listened to, but the people who live there don't. Can you commit to me to doing a much better job on consultation before decisions are made? It's your job. It's in the law, and it is unequivocally not happening, as you and I discussed.
Senator Sullivan, I can commit to consultations before decisions are made. And where we don't agree, I believe that we have changed in the state of Alaska in my choosing Sarah Borio as our regional director, as I have traveled to the village of Kaktovik, also met with the North Slope Borough, have been to King Cove, spent the night at a fish camp on the Yukon River this summer. I could do more, and we will always strive to it, but indeed we really trying to pay attention to the voices of Native Alaskans.
Okay, let me just, Mr. Chairman, sorry, I'm going to go over my time a little bit, but this is really important to me and more importantly to my constituents. I think you need to give special consideration to the people who live in the region in which you are taking these dramatic actions. Would you agree with that?
Senator, I think
That's a pretty easy question. The people who live in the region who are going to be impacted the most deserve special consideration. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Senator, I would say they absolutely deserve consideration, and their considerations are different, but we do, I get asked this all the time. I cannot just say one voice matters more than another. I need to listen to all voices.
Okay, well, I think
but they have
matter.
a special perspective, absolutely.
I think they matter more, and, you know, remarkably, you guys aren't listening to them at all. You listen to, you know, New York City Environmental Group, but not the people who live there. Let me just ask two final questions. We talked about the Vietnam veterans, Alaska Native Vietnam veterans legislation, the career staff at Fish and Wildlife Service codified available refuge lands to extend this ability for these great Vietnam vets, heroic, who weren't treated well. You and I talked about this when they came home from Vietnam. Can I get your commitment if the legislation I introduced has the very lands that your staff proposed, to get your support on that?
Senator Sullivan, I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Okay, and then finally, give me an update, if you wouldn't mind, in this committee on the King Cove Road. Mr. Chairman, I think you're aware, we've been trying to get a 11-mile single-lane dirt road, and you know, Mr. Fouch, if this impacts you guys too, so it would save lives in a Native community. Everybody in the community, 900 people, everybody wants it. 30 years we've been trying to get this done. Won't hurt the wildlife there. Can you give me an update on that, Director Williams? It's something that's enormously important, not just the people of King Cove. The entire state of Alaska is watching this issue.
Senator Sullivan, yes, I appreciate the enormity of this and had very clear direction from the Secretary that this is important to her and the safety of the members of the community in King Cove, that this is important to them. The comment period closed for the notice of intent closed this summer. We are working with a contractor on a supplemental EIS, and we are expediting that as quickly as we can. I have put resources into this matter to be able to get that out by the spring, and I know that we are on a short time frame, and I commit to supporting the Secretary's commitment in this community, and I appreciate its importance.
So spring is what you're shooting at as a target, spring of 2024?
To get the supplemental EIS out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet.
And go Navy, beat Army. I'm going to the game. Are you going to the game?
Whenever I run into, I'm a retired Marine, retired Navy, and a last Vietnam veteran serving in the U.S. Senate. But whenever I come across other veterans, I always salute them. They may have a hat on or a shirt or something. I'll salute them. And I'll say Navy salutes, Air Force, Marines, whatever, Air Force, we have a great bond. But I say when I salute, let's say retired Army folks. And say Navy salutes Army. I say except on one day of the year, and that's the Army-Navy game.
Are you going?
I don't know. We're trying to work it out.
Okay,
We'll see.
good. Well, I'll see you there if you are. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There's. I was talking earlier about the countdown of Beatles songs. One of my favorite Johnny Cash songs is "I've Been Everywhere, Man." I've been everywhere, and you have been. Maybe not everywhere, but you have been to a lot of places, and that is noticed and appreciated by me, and I'm sure by Senator Sullivan, Senator Capito, and others. I want to, close to the end, and I have another question or two that I'd like to share, and one for Mr. Fouch, and then maybe one more for you, Ms. Williams. With respect to balancing the needs of small and large species, Mr. Fouch, vehicles, as we know, pose a major threat to many smaller wildlife species. Some experts believe that over 300 million birds, amphibians, and other small animals are killed on the road each year. Though these collisions are much harder to track, as you know. While our roads and highways pose just as great a risk for these smaller species as they do for larger species, the habitat connectivity needs of smaller species are often overlooked, despite often being less expensive to address. My question is, how did the Federal Highway Administration balance the needs of small species with the needs of large species when selecting grant recipients?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. So the Wildlife Crossing Program is focused on wildlife and vehicle collisions, and safety is a priority of that program and one of the major priorities for that. But what we also see is with the larger animal wildlife crossings, and you mentioned on that as well, is that animals will use it. All animals will use those crossings when we put those in. And so even though the crossings may be very focused on preventing wildlife vehicle collisions and the safety of motorists as well as connectivity of habitat, these crossings can also provide crossings for the smaller habitat as well.
All right, thanks. How about one more question for you?
Yes.
All right. Dealing with the demand for funding, as I believe you shared in your testimony, and I mentioned in my earlier statement, the demand for the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program exceeded the available funding by 5 times. Is that right? 5 times. And how is the Federal Highway Administration leveraging other funding sources? And that would include states, that would include foundations, and maybe even other federal programs. And how are you encouraging grant applications to do the same?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for that question. Yes, the Wildlife Crossing program is eligible under several programs, and some of those include the Highway Safety Improvement Program, Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, our Transportation's Alternatives Program, Federal Lands Access Program, and our Federal Lands Transportation Program, as well as, in certain instances, our Bridge Investment Program and the National Culvert Removal Program. So a lot of our programs have taken into account these wildlife crossings and have made them eligible under those programs, and we promote that as we are looking at as you mentioned, the successfulness that we've had with the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program and through the Notice of Funding, getting in our first round 5 times the amount of what we offered. We see the opportunities of taking advantage of these other federal programs too, and we share that with our stakeholders.
Good. Do you expect that the demand for these dollars will continue to grow? And what might we do here in the legislative branch in the Congress? What could we do in terms of how to address the unmet need?
Well, as you know, Senator, it was a very popular program. Again,
Yeah.
It was 5 times the amount. So I think one thing that is very certain to us all is that this is very popular and it is a great need. And so the funding is just part of that when it's 5 times the amount in the first go around. So,
all right, thank you.
Sir.
I have exhausted my list of questions that I had for you. I'm going to give each of you a couple of minutes, if you'd like to take advantage of it, to share with us any other thoughts that you have that may have come to mind as you sat there and listened to questions, answered questions. But Ms. Williams, why don't you share with us anything you want? Maybe you could tell us what you wish you had been asked, but were not asked. You could maybe do that. And any closing thoughts you have, we'd welcome those. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. And I can't think of a question I wish I had been asked other than appreciating the opportunity to highlight the value of the bipartisan infrastructure law investment and my hope that it can continue into the future. It has been absolutely changed the game for the Fish and Wildlife Service because it has allowed us to leverage our partnerships and bring really larger entities to the table to coordinate and solve the complex conservation challenges before us. It has allowed us to really get to the fundamental issues, whether in the Klamath Basin, improving water availability for fish, people, and migratory birds, in Lake Tahoe, working with partners and tribes to combat aquatic invasive species in the largest functioning wetland in the basin, and that it also protects fish populations and the thriving outdoor recreation economy in Lake Tahoe. Whether it's, I didn't talk enough about the sagebrush ecosystem and our investments there, working with states, tribes, and private landowners to manage invasive grasses, keeping water on the landscape for longer, that helps keep people on the landscape and then helps the communities, and reduce flood risks as well, and revitalize burgeoning communities and economies. And then it's tying all of these landscapes together through the Fish Passage program. And really, I would love to be able to amplify their work and how they've pulled people together for all these really valuable resources, I think even in Appalachia going forward in these biodiversity hotspots. So I guess it's the opportunity to say that we really are impacting people in their everyday lives, and it's that resilience for the future that we've not had this type of investment in before, and we take it very seriously to get the money out the door, to be efficient and demonstrate why this investment was worth it, and that we hope to have it going forward. I would end by saying it has demonstrated in spades that when you give nature a chance, it has a remarkable ability to heal, but we have to give it a chance, and the bipartisan infrastructure law has allowed us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the other songs on the top 100 Beatle list was Give Peace a Chance. So there you go. All right, Mr. Fouch, you get the last word. Maybe I'll get the last word, but you get the next last word. But anything you wish you might have been asked weren't, but any closing thoughts you have, we'd welcome those. Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. No questions that I wish that had been asked, but I do.
Any questions you wish you hadn't been asked?
No question I wish I hadn't been. But I do want to say that I do appreciate the collaboration we've had with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, particularly on the wildlife crossing programs and the things we are learning there. And we look forward for implementing that project and to continue to implement that project. And so we understand the importance of the wildlife crossing program, and also the importance to local, state, and communities out there on providing these projects. And we'll continue to support this program and work collaboratively with our federal and state partners.
Good. I'll close on a musical note. We opened on a musical note in respect of your birthday. One of the songs that made a top 100 list of the Beatles' greatest hits was "When I'm 64." And you're not there yet, but someday you will be. And when I turned 64, that was like last year. No, not really. It was sooner than a little further back. But we've got some great music venues in Wilmington. One's the Grand Opera House. The other's the Queen Theater. We had 1,000 more people who gathered at the Queen Theater. And the last thing that we did, we had like three best rock and roll bands in Delaware. And we closed out the evening, and folks that were kind enough to sing to me "When I'm 64," and which was just a real treat. Someday you'll be 64, but we're just glad that you're here. We're glad that you're both alive and you're doing the work that you're doing. And Mr. Fouch, I know you've not been in this post for very long, but it's a hugely important post. The other songs that I literally jotted down some notes here that could be the theme songs for this committee. One is the "We Can Work It Out," and the song you may have heard a time or two. This committee we work it out. We can't always work everything out, but we work really hard for the money, and we try to find common ground, and we believe that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions, and we appreciate the chance to work with one another, especially with Senator Capito and her team. Another thought has come together, and another blackbird singing in the middle of the night is another song. All those I mention them because they are part of our DNA, part of our culture in this country, and I think on the planet is to say that we care. We want to work together. We want to work to make sure that this planet will be around for not just for us or for our children or grandchildren, but for another million years. And a long time when I won't be on this committee then, but I hope people look back in the future and say that we really made a difference on the work that we're discussing here today. So thank you. We are God's creatures, and as it turns out, it's all the wildlife that we're talking about, the birds, the animals, the deer, are God's creatures as well, and we have a moral obligation to protect human beings and their lives, and I think other creatures and creations on this planet. And with that, let's see here. And I get to do a close. I want to thank both you, Mr. Fouch, and I want to thank Director Williams for joining us today. We thank you for your service to our nation. We appreciate very much your work to implement the provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure law that are making a real difference for our wildlife, for our communities, and our economy. I can tell you how proud I am of the work that Senator Capito, myself, our staffs, our bipartisan members of this committee, the work that was done on that major piece of legislation and the good that flows from it. Before we adjourn, a little bit of housekeeping. Senators are going to be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, December 20th, which is, I think, 2 weeks from your birthday today. And we will compile those questions. We'll send them to our witnesses, and we're going to ask you to reply by Wednesday, January the 10th. Anything else? Anything else? All right. I want to say we wouldn't have these hearings, and they would not be nearly as valuable without the great work of our staffs. And I'd like to think that the members work well together. Frankly, so do our staffs, and if they didn't, we wouldn't get much done. So a big thanks to them. And to everyone, to all of you, and to your families, best wishes for a happy holiday season and a great new year. Thank you so much. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.